Hi, anglers. Tonight's story takes place on Lake Fork in Texas, a legendary lake known for standing timber, deep water, and slow, powerful fish. If you'd like, let me know in the comments where you're hoping to fish tomorrow, what time you're listening right now, and what time you plan to be on the water when morning comes. I love hearing where everyone is settling in, trying to fall asleep a little quicker before an early day of fishing. Now, before the story begins, get comfortable. Close your eyes, slow your breathing, and let the story carry you into a calm day on the water. The morning on Lake Fork began quietly, wrapped in that deep stillness that only exists before the lake fully wakes up. A light mist hovered over the water, softening the outlines of the standing timbers scattered across the lake. The air felt warm even this early, carrying the faint scent of water, earth, and pine drifting in from the shoreline. The sky held a muted gray-blue color as the boat eased away from the ramp, the motor idling low and steady. The surface of the lake lay smooth and dark, barely moving, reflecting the early light in long, gentle streaks that stretched toward the trees. I took my time. There was no reason to rush a morning like this. The sounds around the launch faded quickly. The quiet hum of the motor, the soft ripple of water against the hull, the distant call of birds hidden somewhere among the trees. Everything felt balanced. Tall pines lined the shoreline, their reflections stretching down into the water. The standing timber rose quietly from the lake, dark and still, marking places where big bass waited patiently. I stayed at idle longer than necessary, letting the boat move gently forward while the lake opened up around me. When I finally shut the motor down, the quiet settled in immediately, wrapping around everything without effort. The boat drifted. The lake felt calm beneath my feet, steady, unmoving. Rods rested neatly along the deck, each one rigged with intention. A heavy jig for working timber, a large swim bait ready for slow, deliberate retrieves, a glide bait waiting quietly for later in the day. Nothing rushed, nothing flashy. I picked up the first rod and let its weight settle naturally into my hand. The line ran smooth through the guides, the bait hanging motionless at the tip. The first cast was slow and controlled. The bait arced out toward the timber and slipped into the water quietly, barely disturbing the surface before disappearing below. I watched the line fall slack. Then I waited. Fishing Lake Fork this early was never about speed. It was about patience, about letting big baits move slowly enough to feel real in deep water. I let it sit longer than most people would, giving it time to become part of the lake. When I finally moved it, the motion was small and deliberate. Lift, pause, settle. The rhythm felt calm and confident. The boat drifted slowly as I made another cast, then another, placing each one carefully along the edges of the timber. The water stayed smooth. The mist lingered low. Somewhere below, big bass rested near the wood, suspended comfortably, waiting for something slow enough to be worth moving for. I felt no pressure to find them quickly. This day wasn't about covering water. It was about letting Lake Fork unfold on its own time. As the sky began to brighten and the mist slowly thinned, the lake remained quiet, leaving plenty of time ahead for slow casts, heavy fish, and a long, calm day on the water. As the morning settled in on Lake Fork, the mist thinned slowly, lifting just enough to reveal more of the standing timber scattered across the water. Tall trunks rose quietly from the lake, their reflections stretching downward and fading into the darker water below. Everything felt still and steady, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. I let the boat drift closer to the timber, stopping well short of the nearest tree. There was no need to crowd it. Big fish here were patient, and distance mattered. I picked up the rod again and made a slow, careful cast toward the edge of the wood. The bait traveled quietly through the air and slipped into the water without a sound. I watched the line as it sank, counting slowly, letting the bait fall naturally along the side of the timber. When it reached the bottom, I didn't move it right away. I waited. The pause felt comfortable, unforced. The lake stayed calm around me, barely moving, the surface smooth and dark beneath the early light. When I finally lifted the rod tip, the motion was small and deliberate, just enough to feel the bait rise slightly, then settle again. Lift, pause, settle. The rhythm felt slow and confident. I made another cast, along a neighboring tree, then another, placing each one carefully. The boat drifted quietly, carried by the lake rather than the motor. Nothing rushed. Nothing felt urgent. Fishing timber like this was never about speed. It was about letting the bait move slowly enough to feel natural, giving big bass time to decide without pressure. On one cast, the line stopped sinking sooner than expected. I stayed still. There was no sharp strike, no sudden movement. Just a quiet heaviness where there had been none before. I waited a moment longer, letting the weight settle. Then I leaned back gently. The rod bent deep and steady. The fish didn't surge. It stayed low, pulling slowly, using its weight rather than speed. I kept the pressure even, letting the rod absorb each movement. The water remained calm, barely disturbed. I guided the fish away from the timber without rushing, moving smoothly and patiently. The pressure stayed solid and steady, the fight unfolding quietly. When the base finally came into view, it did so slowly, its broad shape resting just beneath the surface. I guided it alongside the boat and lifted it gently, feeling its heavy weight and balance for a brief moment before easing it back into the lake. It paused there, suspended in the water. Then it slipped back down and disappeared among the timber below. The surface closed over it without sound. I rested the rod and took a slow breath, letting the calm return fully. In, out. The lake remained quiet. The timber stood still. The morning light continued to spread slowly across the water. I made another slow cast, then another, returning to the same patient rhythm. Cast, pause, lift, settle. The day felt wide open now, full of unhurried moments waiting ahead. And Lake Fork continued to hold its calm, offering plenty of time for slow casts, heavy fish, and a steady rhythm that carried the morning forward. As the morning on Lake Fork continued to open up, the light grew warmer, settling softly across the water and the standing timber. The mist had lifted now, leaving the lake wide and clear. The surface stayed calm, reflecting the trees and sky in long, steady lines that moved slowly with the drift. I stayed where I was, letting the boat drift just enough to cover new water without rushing past anything important. This was the time for big baits. I picked up a rod rigged with a large swim bait and let its weight settle naturally into my hands. The bait hung quietly at the tip, heavy and still, waiting for slow movement. The cast was smooth and deliberate. The swim bait arced out toward the timber and slipped into the water with barely a ripple. I watched it sink, counting slowly, letting it fall into the space where big bass rested comfortably. When it reached depth, I began the retrieve. Slow, steady, unbroken. The bait moved through the water with a gentle rhythm, swinging slightly with each turn of the handle. I kept my movements minimal, letting the bait do the work without forcing it. The lake stayed quiet. The timber stood motionless. Somewhere below, bass followed patiently, studying the movement without urgency. I made another long, slow cast, then another, covering the same stretch of water with careful repetition. Each retrieve followed the same calm pattern, unhurried and confident. Cast, sink, slow reel. The rhythm felt grounding. On one cast, halfway back to the boat, I felt a subtle change. A heaviness that built slowly rather than striking all at once. I didn't react. I stayed calm, letting the pressure become clear before leaning back gently. The rod loaded deep, bending smoothly under steady weight. This fish felt heavier. It moved slowly, pulling with calm strength, staying deep and deliberate. There was no rush in the fight, no sudden surge, just a steady, confident pull. I kept the rod angle low and steady, guiding the fish away from the timber without forcing it. The water barely changed as the fish moved beneath the surface. The fight unfolded quietly, absorbed by the rod and the calm of the lake. When the base finally came into view, it did so slowly, its wide shape resting just under the surface, dark against the lighter water. I guided it alongside the boat and lifted it gently, feeling its solid weight for a brief moment before easing it back into the lake. It paused there, suspended, then drifted downward and disappeared. The lake closed over it as if nothing had happened. I rested the rod and took a slow breath. In, out. The confidence stayed with me, not as excitement, but as calm assurance. The lake felt cooperative, steady, unhurried. I continued making slow, deliberate casts with the swim bait, repeating the same patient retrieve. Some casts passed without anything happening. That felt right. Big fish here didn't rush. They waited. As the sun continued to climb and the shadows around the timber softened, Lake Fork held its steady rhythm, inviting slow movement, heavy bites, and a calm confidence that settled deeper with every cast. As the morning settled deeper into Lake Fork, the lake seemed to grow heavier and calmer at the same time. The sun climbed just enough to warm the surface, but the water remained dark and steady beneath the standing timber. Shadows stretched softly along the trunks, creating quiet pockets where big fish rested without movement. I stayed patient, letting the boat drift slowly along the same line of trees. There was no need to change anything. I picked up the rod with the heavy jig and made a slow, careful cast toward the base of a thick trunk rising from the water. The bait slipped down the side of the wood and disappeared beneath the surface. I watched the line fall. Halfway down, it stopped. Not abruptly, just stopped. I didn't move right away. I waited, letting the moment settle, letting the weight become clear rather than forcing it to reveal itself. The lake stayed calm. The surface barely moved. Then I leaned back gently. The rod bent deep, deeper than before, loading with solid, steady pressure. This fish felt different, heavier, more deliberate. It didn't surge or shake. It stayed low, pulling slowly, confidently, using its weight rather than speed. I kept the pressure even, my movements smooth and controlled. The timber stood quietly around us as the fish moved away from it, guided patiently by the rod. The water remained calm, barely disturbed by the fight unfolding beneath the surface. Time slowed even more. Each movement of the fish was absorbed by the rod. Each response from me was unhurried. There was no rush to bring it in. When the base finally rose toward the surface, it did so gradually, its wide shape appearing just beneath the water, dark and steady. I guided it alongside the boat and lifted it gently, feeling its heavy weight settle briefly into my hands before easing it back into the lake. It rested there for a moment, suspended in the water, fins moving slowly. Then it drifted downward and disappeared into the dark below. The lake closed over it without sound. I set the rod down and took a slow breath. In, out. The calm returned immediately, as if the moment had simply folded back into the lake. There was no celebration, no rush to cast again, just the quiet satisfaction of a heavy fish encountered calmly, on its own terms. I stayed there for a while, letting the boat drift, letting the lake settle again around me. The timber stood tall and still. The sun continued its slow rise. When I finally picked the rod back up, I did so without urgency, ready to return to the same patient rhythm. Cast, pause, wait. Lake Fork remained wide and quiet, offering no pressure and no hurry. Just steady water, heavy fish, and a calm confidence that continued to grow with each slow, deliberate cast. By the time the morning fully settled over Lake Fork, everything felt steady and familiar. The sun sat a little higher now, warming the air and softening the shadows around the standing timber. The mist had completely faded, leaving the lake wide and clear, its surface smooth and undisturbed. The boat drifted quietly, guided by the lake rather than the motor. I stayed relaxed, letting the calm of the morning guide each movement. This was the rhythm. I picked up the rod again and made another slow, deliberate cast along the timber line. The bait slipped quietly into the water and sank, disappearing into the dark below. I waited. The pause felt natural now, no longer something I needed to think about. My hands followed the rhythm on their own. When I lifted the rod tip, the motion was small and controlled, just enough to feel the bait rise slightly before settling again. Lift, pause, settle. The pattern repeated itself easily. Some casts brought nothing at all. That felt right. Fishing Lake Fork wasn't about constant action. It was about trusting the water, letting big fish move when they were ready, not when I wanted them to. On another cast, I felt a quiet weight on the line, not heavy this time, just enough to be noticeable. I leaned back gently and felt the rod bend with steady pressure. The fish moved calmly, staying close to the timber before easing away. I guided it slowly, keeping the pressure even, letting the rod absorb each movement. When it surfaced, it did so quietly, its shape resting just beneath the water. I lifted it briefly and eased it back into the lake without hesitation. The calm returned instantly. I rested the rod across my lap and took a slow breath, letting the confidence settle deeper rather than rise outward. In, out. The lake felt cooperative now, not because anything had changed, but because I had slowed down enough to move with it. I continued making slow casts, repeating the same gentle motions, letting the boat drift naturally along the timber. The sun warmed the deck beneath my feet. The water stayed calm. Each moment felt complete on its own. The morning passed quietly, carried forward by steady casts and long pauses. The lake offered no urgency, no pressure, only the calm rhythm of slow movement and patient waiting. As Lake Fork continued to unfold, the confidence stayed with me, quiet, grounded, and unhurried, settling fully into the steady pace of the day. As the sun climbed higher over Lake Fork, the feeling on the water began to change. The light grew brighter, but never harsh, spreading evenly across the lake and softening the reflections around the standing timber. The air felt warmer now, heavier in a comfortable way, settling gently over the surface. The water stayed calm. I let the boat drift farther from the ramp area, easing into deeper water, where the timber thinned and the lake opened up. The shoreline pulled slowly into the distance, framed by tall pines that stood quiet and still. This was the part of the day when patience mattered even more. I picked up the rod again and made a long, deliberate cast along a deeper edge near a creek channel. The bait slipped into the water and began its slow descent. I watched the line. Then I waited. The pause felt longer now, stretching comfortably as the bait settled deeper into the lake. I didn't rush to move it. I let it sit, resting on the bottom, becoming part of the structure. When I finally lifted the rod tip, the movement was minimal, just enough to feel the weight shift before settling again. Lift, pause, rest. The rhythm stayed steady and calm. The boat drifted slowly, barely moving, the water holding it in place. The sun warmed my shoulders as I stood quietly, letting the lake guide the pace. Some casts passed without anything happening at all. That felt right. Big fish here didn't move quickly once the sun climbed. They waited, settled deep, comfortable in the warmer water. On one cast, the line felt a little heavier than before. Not enough to rush, just enough to notice. I stayed still. The rod rested easily in my hands as I let the weight become clear. When I leaned back gently, the rod bent with smooth, steady pressure. The fish stayed deep, pulling slowly, deliberately. There was no sudden movement, no rush to the surface. I kept the pressure even, letting the rod absorb each pull. The fight unfolded quietly, without urgency, each moment stretching comfortably. When the base finally rose into view, it did so calmly, its broad shape visible just beneath the surface. I guided it alongside the boat and lifted it gently, feeling its solid weight for a brief moment before easing it back into the lake. It rested there, suspended for a second, then drifted away into the deeper water. The lake closed over it without sound. I rested the rod and took a slow breath. In, out. The warmth of the day settled in more fully now, encouraging stillness. The lake felt wide and steady, offering no pressure to move or change. I stayed there, drifting quietly, making slow casts and longer pauses, letting the sun rise higher and the water warm gradually, allowing Lake Fork to ease naturally into its midday rhythm. As the day on Lake Fork moved closer to midday, the lake seemed to settle even further into itself. The sun stood higher now, warming the surface and deepening the shadows around the standing timber. Beneath the water, the creek channels carved quiet paths through the lake, holding cooler water and steady structure where big fish rested comfortably. I eased the boat along the edge of one of these channels, letting it drift parallel without using the motor. The water here felt deeper, heavier, more still. This was a place that rewarded patience. I picked up a rod rigged with a heavier bait and made a slow, deliberate cast along the channel edge. The bait slipped into the water and sank steadily, disappearing into the darker depths below. I watched the line. Then I waited. The pause felt longer now, stretching comfortably as the bait settled near the bottom. I didn't move it right away. I let it rest, allowing the lake to hold it in place. When I finally lifted the rod tip, the movement was small and controlled, just enough to feel the bait rise slightly before settling again. Lift, pause, rest. The rhythm stayed calm and predictable. The boat drifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, carried by the gentle movement of the water. The shoreline remained quiet in the distance, framed by tall pines that barely moved in the still air. Some casts passed without anything happening. That felt right. Fishing deeper water like this wasn't about constant action. It was about trusting the structure, letting big fish move when they were ready. On one cast, the line felt heavier than before. Not sharp, not sudden, just steady. I stayed still, letting the weight confirm itself. When I leaned back gently, the rod bent deep, loading with solid pressure. The fish stayed down, pulling slowly, confidently, using its weight rather than speed. I kept the pressure even, letting the rod do the work. The water remained calm, barely disturbed by the movement below. I guided the fish patiently along the channel edge, never rushing, never forcing. The fight unfolded quietly, absorbed by the rod and the depth of the lake. When the base finally came into view, it did so slowly, its wide shape resting just beneath the surface. I guided it alongside the boat and lifted it gently, feeling its heavy weight for a brief moment before easing it back into the lake. It lingered there for a second, suspended in the water. Then it drifted back down into the channel and disappeared. The lake returned to stillness. I set the rod down and took a slow breath. In, out. The calm settled back in fully. I stayed there, drifting quietly along the channel, making slow casts and long pauses, letting Lake Fork hold its steady pace, deep, quiet, and unhurried, as the day continued to unfold. As the midday warmth settled fully over Lake Fork, the lake seemed to grow heavier and quieter at the same time. The sun held high above the trees, casting even light across the water and timber. The air felt warm and still, wrapping gently around everything on the lake. Beneath the surface, the water stayed dark and calm, holding its depth without movement. I stayed near the same stretch of deeper water, letting the boat drift slowly along the edge of the creek channel. There was no reason to move quickly. I picked up the rod again and made a long, deliberate cast toward the darker water, where the channel dropped away. The bait slipped into the lake and sank steadily, disappearing into the quiet below. I watched the line. Then I waited. The pause felt long and complete. I let the bait rest on the bottom, unmoving, allowing it to blend into the lake rather than stand out. When I finally lifted the rod tip, the motion was small and controlled, just enough to feel the bait rise slightly before settling again. Lift, pause, rest. On the second lift, the line felt heavier. Not sudden, not sharp, just solid. I stayed still for a moment, letting the weight become clear. When I leaned back gently, the rod bent deep, loading with steady pressure. This fish felt heavy. It didn't rush. It didn't surge. It stayed deep, pulling slowly, confidently, using its weight rather than speed. I kept the pressure even, letting the rod absorb each movement without forcing anything. The water remained calm, barely disturbed by the fight unfolding below the surface. I guided the fish patiently along the channel edge, keeping steady pressure, never rushing. The fight unfolded quietly, each movement slow and deliberate. When the base finally rose toward the surface, it did so gradually, its broad shape appearing just beneath the water. I guided it alongside the boat and lifted it gently, feeling its heavy weight settle briefly into my hands. It was another big fish, solid, balanced, calm. I held it for only a moment before easing it back into the lake. It rested there, suspended, fins moving slowly. Then it drifted downward and disappeared into the deep water below. The lake closed over it without sound. I rested the rod and took a slow breath. In, out. The calm returned immediately. The sun stayed high. The water stayed still. The timber stood quietly around me. I stayed there, drifting slowly, making gentle casts and longer pauses, letting Lake Fork continue to unfold at its own steady pace. Calm, heavy, and unhurried. As the afternoon on Lake Fork settled into its steady rhythm, everything began to feel familiar again. The sun remained high, warming the surface of the lake and softening the shadows around the timber. The air felt still and heavy in a comfortable way, resting quietly over the water. I stayed where I was, letting the boat drift slowly along the same stretch of deeper water. There was no reason to change anything. I picked up the rod and made another long, deliberate cast toward the edge of the channel. The bait slipped into the water and sank, disappearing into the calm below. I watched the line. Then I waited. The pause felt easy now, something my body understood without effort. I let the bait rest on the bottom, unmoving, becoming part of the lake. When I finally lifted the rod tip, the movement was minimal. Just enough to feel the weight rise slightly before settling again. Lift, pause, rest. The pattern repeated itself naturally. Cast after cast followed the same steady rhythm. Sometimes nothing happened at all. That felt right. Fishing Lake Fork at this time of day wasn't about forcing bites. It was about letting the rod do the work, trusting the weight of the bait and the patience of the fish. On one cast, the line felt different, not heavier, just steady in a way that suggested something had changed. I stayed still. The rod rested calmly in my hands as I waited. When I leaned back gently, the rod bent smoothly, loading with solid pressure. The fish moved slowly, staying deep, pulling with steady weight rather than speed. I didn't rush. I let the rod absorb each movement, guiding the fish without forcing it. The water remained calm, barely disturbed by the slow fight unfolding beneath the surface. When the base finally came into view, it did so quietly, its wide shape resting just beneath the surface. I guided it alongside the boat and lifted it gently, feeling its solid weight for a brief moment, before easing it back into the lake. It drifted downward without resistance, disappearing into the darker water below. The calm returned immediately. I rested the rod and took a slow breath. In, out. The lake stayed steady. The timber remained quiet. The warmth of the day settled comfortably into my shoulders. I continued making slow casts, repeating the same calm motions, letting the repetition deepen the sense of ease. Each cast felt the same. Each pause felt complete. As the afternoon continued, Lake Fork held its steady pace, inviting patience, repetition, and a quiet trust that carried the day forward without effort. By the time midday settled fully over Lake Fork, the lake felt wrapped in warmth. The sun stood high above the trees, but the light had softened, spreading evenly across the water and timber. The air felt thick and still, resting gently against everything it touched. Even the standing timber seemed to hold its breath, casting long, quiet shadows beneath the surface. The boat barely drifted now. If I hadn't been watching closely, it would have been easy to believe I was completely still, floating in place without direction. The lake felt calm and steady beneath my feet. I set the rod down and sat quietly for a long moment, letting my body relax fully. There was no need to cast right away, no need to move. My breathing slowed naturally, in, out. Each breath felt deeper than the last, spreading warmth through my shoulders and back before easing away again. The lake seemed to follow the same rhythm, expanding and settling in quiet cycles. After a while, I picked up the rod again and made a short, gentle cast toward the deeper water near the channel edge. The bait slipped into the lake and sank steadily, disappearing into the dark below. I didn't move it right away. I let it rest. The pause felt long and complete, stretching comfortably without edges. The lake didn't ask for motion. It simply held everything in place. When I finally lifted the rod tip, the movement was minimal, just enough to feel the bait shift slightly before settling again. Lift, pause, rest. The pattern felt slower now, heavier, more deliberate. Some casts passed without anything happening at all. That felt right. Big bass here rested through the heat of the day, settled deep and comfortable, moving only when something felt worth the effort. I stayed there, drifting quietly, making slow casts and longer pauses. The sun warmed the deck beneath my feet. The water stayed smooth and undisturbed. Time felt wide here. Minutes passed without needing to be counted. Each moment flowed gently into the next, blending together without sharp edges. I reeled in slowly and rested the rod again, leaning back slightly as the boat floated quietly in place. The Texas heat felt steady and calm, not demanding movement, just encouraging stillness. As midday held its position over Lake Fork, the lake remained quiet, wide, deep, and unhurried, carrying everything forward at its own gentle pace. As the afternoon moved slowly past midday on Lake Fork, the light began to change. The sun drifted westward, lowering just enough to soften the brightness across the lake. The standing timber and tall pines along the shoreline took on deeper tones, their reflections stretching longer across the water. The air felt a little lighter now. The heat remained, but it no longer pressed down. Instead, it rested gently, allowing the lake to breathe again. I let the boat drift quietly, carried by a faint movement in the water. The surface stayed smooth, broken only by soft ripples that faded almost as soon as they appeared. I picked up the rod again and made a slow, easy cast along the edge of a submerged tree line. The bait slipped into the water and sank steadily. I watched the line. Then I waited. The pause felt natural, unforced. I let the bait rest, blending into the calm below. When I finally moved it, the motion was small and deliberate, just enough to feel the bait rise slightly before settling again. Lift, Pause. Rest. The rhythm felt familiar. Grounding. The boat drifted gently as I made another cast, then another, repeating the same slow presentation. The lake stayed quiet, holding the soft afternoon light without disturbance. On one cast, I felt a quiet heaviness on the line. Not sudden, just steady. I stayed calm. When I leaned back gently, the rod bent smoothly, loading with solid pressure. The fish moved slowly, pulling with steady weight rather than speed. I kept the pressure even, guiding it patiently away from the timber. The water barely changed as the fish moved beneath the surface. The fight unfolded quietly, without urgency. When the base came into view, it did so calmly, its broad shape resting just beneath the surface. I guided it alongside the boat and lifted it gently, feeling its solid weight for a brief moment before easing it back into the lake. It paused there, suspended in the water, then drifted downward and disappeared. The lake returned to stillness. I rested the rod and took a slow breath. In, out. The afternoon continued to soften around me. The pines along the shoreline darkened slightly as the light shifted. Shadows stretched quietly across the water. I stayed there, drifting gently, making slow casts and longer pauses, letting the changing light guide the pace. Calm, unhurried, and steady, as Lake Fork eased slowly toward evening. As the afternoon on Lake Fork continued to drift forward, the lake seemed to grow quieter again. The light softened further, settling into warmer tones that spread gently across the water. The standing timber cast long, calm reflections, and the pines along the shoreline rested in deeper shadow. I stayed where I was, letting the boat drift without direction. There was no need to move. I picked up the rod with the large swim bait again and made a slow, deliberate cast toward a deeper pocket between two standing trees. The bait slipped quietly into the water and began its steady descent. I watched the line. Then I waited. The pause felt long and complete. I let the bait sink deep, giving it time to settle naturally into the space where big fish waited. When I finally began the retrieve, it was slow and steady. No sudden movement, no change in pace. The swim bait moved gently through the water, swinging slightly with each quiet turn of the handle. Halfway back, I felt it. Not a strike, just weight. A slow building heaviness that hadn't been there a moment before. I didn't react right away. I let the pressure grow, letting the fish take the bait fully before leaning back gently. The rod bent deep, deeper than it had all day, loading with calm, solid pressure. This fish felt big. It didn't rush. It didn't surge. It stayed deep, pulling slowly, confidently, using its weight rather than speed. I kept the rod steady, letting it absorb each movement without forcing anything. The lake remained calm, barely disturbed by the slow fight unfolding beneath the surface. Time seemed to stretch open. Each pull from the fish was slow and deliberate. Each response from me was measured and calm. When the base finally rose toward the surface, it did so gradually, its wide shape appearing just beneath the water. I guided it alongside the boat and lifted it gently, feeling its heavy weight settle briefly into my hands. It was a giant, thick, balanced, calm. I held it only for a moment before easing it back into the lake. It rested there, suspended just below the surface, fins moving slowly. Then it drifted downward and disappeared into the dark water below. The lake closed smoothly over it. I rested the rod across my lap and took a slow breath. In, out. The calm returned fully, as if the lake had quietly accepted the moment and moved on. I stayed there, drifting gently, letting the afternoon settle again. There was no urge to cast immediately, no pressure to find another fish. That one felt complete. As the light continued to soften and the shadows lengthened across Lake Fork, the lake held its steady rhythm, quiet, warm, and unhurried, offering nothing but time and calm as the day continued its slow slide toward evening. As the afternoon eased closer to evening on Lake Fork, the need to catch another fish faded completely. The lake felt settled now, as if it had already given everything it needed to give. The water remained calm and open, holding the softer light of late afternoon in long, steady reflections. I stayed where I was, letting the boat drift slowly without direction. There was no reason to move, no reason to search. After a while, I picked up the rod again and made a slow, easy cast toward open water. The bait slipped quietly into the lake and sank, disappearing beneath the surface without disturbance. I didn't watch the line closely. Instead, I let my eyes rest on the water itself, following the gentle movement of reflections and shadows. The pause stretched comfortably, long enough to feel complete on its own. Nothing happened. That felt right. I reeled in slowly, feeling the steady resistance of the line moving through the guides, then set the rod down again. The boat continued drifting, carried gently by the lake. After another long pause, I made one more cast, placing it softly along the same stretch of water. The bait landed quietly and sank again. I waited. The lake didn't ask for movement. It didn't ask for attention. It simply held the moment open, allowing everything to exist quietly. I leaned back slightly, letting my shoulders relax and my breathing slow. In, out. The rhythm of breath matched the gentle movement of the boat. The surface stayed smooth, the reflections shifting lazily as the light continued to soften. Time felt wide here. Minutes passed without needing to be counted. Each cast blended into the next, each pause stretching comfortably forward. Sometimes I let the bait sit without moving it at all. Other times, I lifted the rod tip just enough to feel the bait shift slightly before letting it settle again. Lift, pause, rest. The pattern repeated quietly, without intention. I found myself casting less often now, resting more between movements. The lake felt full, offering no reason to rush or change anything. The breeze stayed light, the water stayed calm. The afternoon light grew warmer and softer. Thoughts drifted through gently, never staying long. Memories of other calm days on the water. Early mornings, long drifts. They came and went without pulling me along with them. I stayed right where I was. As the day continued its slow fade, Lake Fork held its steady rhythm, calm, open, and unhurried, inviting everything on the water to remain exactly as it was, floating gently without expectation, without effort, simply drifting toward evening. As evening approached on Lake Fork, the lake grew quieter still. The sun lowered slowly behind the pines, softening the light into warm, muted tones that spread gently across the water. The standing timber faded into darker silhouettes, their reflections stretching longer and thinner as the day eased forward. I let the boat drift into more open water, away from the trees, where the lake felt wider and more open. The surface remained smooth, broken only by faint ripples that disappeared almost as soon as they formed. I set the rod down beside me and leaned back slightly, letting my body relax fully. There was nothing left to do. The warmth of the day lingered softly, balanced by cooler air beginning to settle in. The lake felt steady beneath the boat, holding everything in a calm, even stillness. My breathing slowed naturally. In, out. Each breath felt unhurried and deep, matching the gentle motion of the water. The sounds around me softened. Faint water against the hull, distant birds settling along the shoreline, the quiet presence of the lake holding everything in place. Nothing stood out. Nothing asked for attention. After a long while, I made one slow, gentle cast into the open water. The bait slipped into the lake without a sound and sank quietly. I didn't move it. I let it rest. The paws stretched comfortably, without edges. Time felt wide here, no longer something to measure or guide. The sky continued to darken slowly. The water reflected the changing light in long, calm streaks that shifted gently as the boat drifted. I stayed still, allowing the moment to remain exactly as it was. Sometimes I watched the reflections move. Other times, I let my eyes rest, half closed, feeling the quiet motion beneath me. Breathing stayed slow. In, out. The day felt complete in its own quiet way, not ending sharply, just settling into something softer. There was nothing left to look for, nothing left to find, only the steady presence of the lake, the slow drift of the boat, and the calm rhythm of breath and water moving together. As the last light of day continued to fade, Lake Fork held its stillness, wide, quiet, and unhurried, allowing everything on the water to drift gently forward toward rest. As evening settled fully over Lake Fork, the lake grew quieter than it had been all day. The last light faded slowly, not disappearing all at once, but softening into deeper shades of blue and gray. The standing timber became dark silhouettes against the dimming sky, their reflections stretching gently across the water. The boat floated easily now, carried by the lake without effort or direction. The surface beneath it moved slowly, barely noticeable, creating a feeling of complete stillness. I stayed seated, resting comfortably, letting the calm of the evening settle in fully. There was nothing left to do. The rods lay quietly beside me, lines slack, baits resting unseen beneath the surface. Fishing had faded naturally into the background, becoming part of the stillness rather than the focus. My breathing slowed even more. In, out. Each breath felt deeper and heavier, spreading calm through my body before easing away again. The lake seemed to follow the same rhythm, expanding and settling in quiet cycles. The shoreline faded into shadow, leaving only open water and the soft movement of reflections. Distant sounds blended together. Faint water against the hull, a bird settling somewhere among the trees, the quiet presence of the lake, holding everything in place. Nothing needed attention. Nothing needed to change. I leaned back slightly, letting my body sink into the gentle motion of the boat. The warmth of the day lingered softly, balanced by the cooler air of evening. Time felt wide here. Moments passed without needing to be counted. The lake held everything steady, allowing the day to fade without hurry. The water remained smooth. The sky continued to darken. The reflections softened and stretched. There was a sense of completion, not because something had ended, but because everything had settled exactly where it belonged. As the boat drifted quietly across Lake Fork, the last traces of daylight slipped away. The water held its calm. The air stayed still. Breathing remained slow and steady. In, out. And as Lake Fork rested beneath the evening sky, wide, calm, and unhurried, it became easy to let go completely, to remain suspended in the quiet, carried gently by the water, as the day dissolved fully into rest. There was nowhere else to be, nothing else to do. Only the slow rhythm of breath, the gentle movement of the lake, and the calm of evening settling in, steady, quiet, and peaceful.